October 31st, 1957, Los Angeles, California. Community Street and Sun Valley is alive with the sounds of children in costume laughing as they knocked on doors for Halloween treats. But in the middle of the joyful chaos, someone was out for far more than candy. Someone was hunting. When Peter Fabiano opened his door at 11 p.m., he was met by not with an innocent trick-or-treater, but by a masked figure with a deadly secret. With a single gunshot, Peter lay dying on his own doorstep, and the community was left in shock. What seemed like a mob hit was soon revealed to be something even more chilling, a twisted love triangle. This crime is filled with hidden motives, dangerous friendships, and a woman willing to kill for more than just love. This is Joan Robble, the Trick-or-Treat Murder. Hey y'all, I'm Chris Calvert.
And I'm her husband, Rob Pottle. Welcome to Hitched to Homicide.
For better or worse.
Till death do us part.
Welcome back, everybody.
Yes, welcome. And for all of our friends here in Lexington, Kentucky.
Yeah.
Hey, y'all. Welcome.
Come on in, sit a spell.
That's it.
How's your mama and them?
And them. That's it.
Well, wherever you're listening, be sure to hit that subscribe button, then like, rate, and review the podcast so others who are just like you and love true crime can find us.
Yep.
And if you're watching us on YouTube, hit that subscribe button below. You can find us on Instagram at Hitched to Homicide or on X at H2H_podcast. And if you want true crime every single day of the week, go join our closed Facebook group, The In-Laws and Outlaws.
Yep.
Just go to Facebook, type in H2H, In-Laws and Outlaws, answer a couple questions you're in, go join. We love those people.
A lot of fun.
I'm doing a Halloween case today. We've got a whole list of Halloween movies that everybody needs to watch, and everybody's favorites are in there. Everybody's given their suggestions.
Yep.
More than true crime.
Everybody always has suggestions.
They do.
Yep.
We also now have a Buy Me a Coffee link if you want to send some coffee our way to Rob or something to me.
Yes, and I have to give a special shout out today to Melinda Ransom, who sent 2 coffees. But
Yeah.
she writes coffee for Rob and a Diet Dew for Chris. Thanks for the weekly dose of murder and mayhem delivered by my favorite kooky couple. Melissa, thank you. That's one of the best compliments we could have ever gotten.
I love being a kooky couple.
Absolutely.
Why not? Why not being a kooky couple?
I always say, we love each other, and the reason is because we're the only 2 people that can put up with each other.
Oh, that's not true. That's not true.
That's awesome.
But if you want to send us a coffee or a Diet Dew, you can find that link in our show notes.
Yep.
You can also send us a text. The link to that is also at the very top of our show notes. It says, send to Chris and Rob a text.
Yes.
Well, before we get started today, I wanted to do a funny little story.
Okay.
Are you ready for this?
I don't know.
So a burglar breaks into a house.
Okay.
And he's rummaging around and he starts to get the stereo and go through the jewelry, and he hears, Jesus knows you're here.
Uh-oh.
And he's like, wait, what? So he, keeps going. That can't be real.
Yeah.
He keeps going. He's digging through. He's starting to put stuff in his bag, and he hears, Jesus is watching you. So then he freaks out. He clicks on his flashlight, and he's putting it around everywhere, and he sees this parrot in the corner. And he says, are you the one saying that? And the parrot says, yeah. And he goes, well, who the hell are you? He goes, I'm Moses. And he goes, who names their parrot Moses? And Moses says, the same people who named their Rottweiler Jesus.
Very good.
Don't burgle a house.
That's funny.
You never know who's there. Jesus might be watching you.
Exactly.
Well, we're getting close to Halloween. I wanted to do a case that happens on that night, and I found this one from 1957. You know how I love to go back. Y'all, I read every single newspaper article about this. It was too good.
Cool.
Before we get started, let me thank some sources. Vice.com, Medium.com, the Valley Times, the LA Times, the Daily Mail, the Los Angeles Evening Citizen News, a paper that doesn't even exist anymore, Deranged LA Crimes, and Crime and Investigation.
All right. Okay. You ready?
I am. You ready to go to 1957?
Let's do it.
Peter Fabiano.
Oh.
I got to stop right there. What a great name.
Hey, baby, I'm Peter Fabiano.
Fabiano, right?
Yeah, it's perfect.
It was perfect. Peter was born on February 7th, 1922 in Lansing, Michigan, to Paul and Rosina Fabiano. His parents were Italian immigrants from Calabria in southern Italy. Mm-hmm. That's actually the birthplace of the name of Italy, given to it by ancient Greeks who settled the area in the 8th century BC and is home to Pythagoras, the one who gave you the theorem.
There's your history lesson for the day, folks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So cool. All those ancient Greeks that were in Italy.
Yeah.
But he was a United States Marine during World War II, where he was a sergeant. And when the war is over, and in 1948, Peter is actually convicted of bookmaking.
Oh.
He's a bookie.
Okay.
And wait till you hear what he got for being a bookie.
Okay.
180 days in the county jail.
Wow. That's pretty severe for being a bookie.
Yeah. I mean, when I read that, I thought, now we have online betting. This guy's rolling over in his grave.
Yeah, exactly.
He's rolling over in his grave for more reasons than just this. But
he was just ahead of his time.
He was. But he eventually meets and marries Betty Solomon. She's a beautiful divorcee who sometimes went by Bessie instead of Betty. Okay. Betty already had 2 children from her first husband. She had a son named Richard and a daughter named Judy. Daughter Judy. Jane, his wife.
We're off the rails already.
Off the rails early. These 2 are in their late 20s when they meet. They fall in love and marry, and they move the family to Kingston, New York. Now, Peter and Betty would never have children of their own, but Peter loved Richard and Judy just like they were his own kids. Okay. And during this time, Pete, she called him Pete, worked as a bartender. I read where he was also a truck driver. But Betty was a beautician. She'd been a single mom, raising 2 kids and working, and Betty convinces Pete to try his hand at cutting and styling hair. Mm. And guess what? Somebody with the name Fabiano was really good at cutting and styling hair. Go figure.
And Buddy, business was a booming.
These 2 moved to Los Angeles with the 2 kids and opened up a hair salon. Peter was actually Betty's stylist. And business was so good that they opened a second salon. They had one at 361 South Fairfax Avenue in L.A. and one at 12118 Sylvan Street in Hollywood.
I mean, with the name of Fabiano, you have to have some sort of style.
Oh, he's got great Italian hair, too.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Yeah. Betty and Pete hire a freelance photographer to come in and take some photos of the salons, and they actually hire her after this to do some reception work. Her name is Joan Robel. Joan was older. She was also a divorcee who was originally from Lithuania, but she had lived in Hollywood for quite some time. She was a writer and an artist, and she would even travel back and forth between California and Hawaii in order to study English and creative writing at the University of Honolulu.
Oh, wow.
So she's a strong woman who's in her 40s.
Okay. Now,
Joan became well acquainted with the couple, specifically Betty, with whom she often met for coffee and conversation. It was during one of these chats that Betty confided in Joan about her husband's dark side. He could be a little violent. He could be a little controlling. Mm-hmm. And honestly, I think what bothered Pete the most was Joan. He didn't like how she always tried to come between him and his wife, Betty.
Gotcha.
And Pete and Betty's marriage kind of hit a rough patch. And the more Betty confided in Joan, the more Joan became infatuated with the beautiful red-headed Betty. Betty and Joan became super close, and Joan encourages Betty to move out of the house, get away from Pete.
Really?
And she does. And she moves in with Joan. Now, the newspapers called their relationship, quote, abnormal, end quote, which, of course, is code for homosexual.
Right.
And it was against the law to be outwardly homosexual at that time.
Wow.
Now, I don't know if Betty was actually a lesbian. I do believe that Joan was. And Peter doesn't like this much. His wife's is moving in with this woman and away from him.
Right.
But Betty soon tired of Joan. She got tired of her. And she decided she wanted to give her marriage a real chance. And she could only do that if she moved home to be with Pete.
Right.
And they both wanted to rekindle this relationship. They shared these salons together. He'd been a real father to her children. And she goes back to Pete. But Pete has some stipulations. Pete tells Betty that you can come back and let's work on our marriage, but I don't want you to ever see Joan again. I don't want you talking to her. I don't want you to see her. And I never want to hear her name again.
Okay.
And Betty said, okay.
Wow.
She agreed. She promptly cut Joan out of her life completely. You're just done.
Right.
Cut her off.
Right.
And Joan, who was working part-time as a receptionist.
Let me guess, she wasn't too happy about this.
Well, she's fired on top of all of this. They fire her.
Yep.
And while Betty tried to get her marriage back on track with Pete, Joan had other friends to talk to, and one of them was a woman named Goldine Pizer.
Goldine.
Goldine was older like Joan. She was a widow. She worked as a lab technician at a children's hospital, but her dream was to become a nurse. And Goldine met Joan at a party in 1953 when Joan was taking pictures of her and her date. And they became, I thought this was cute, coffee clatch friends. That's what was in the newspaper.
You had me at coffee.
Coffee clatch friends. Quote, Joan knew so much about culture, art, music, all that sort of thing, end quote. And for as much as Joan was infatuated with Betty, Goldine was infatuated with Joan. And many people who've researched this crime believe that Goldine and Joan were actually in a relationship.
Okay.
I am one of those people who believes that.
Right.
Now, after Betty exits Joan's life, all she could talk about with Goldine was how horrible and how vile Peter was. He was awful to Betty. He was destroying her life. And they needed to save Betty from her husband.
Whoa, okay.
And since Pete no longer allowed Betty to have contact with Joan, she tells Goldine the only way to fix this problem is to get rid of Peter.
Whoa.
Quote, then about a year ago, she, meaning Joan, began to call me more often. It was around July 1957 that she began talking about Pete Fabiano. She said, we had to get rid of him, end quote. This is Goldine speaking.
Man.
So for 3.5 months, Joan and Goldine discuss every tiny detail of how to kill Pete Fabiano.
Wow.
They were kind of undecided whether they should use poison or a knife or a gun. And apparently this was the talk every single day, every single night, all the time, incessantly. How do we kill Pete Fabiano?
It was almost like an obsession now.
It was an obsession for Joan.
Wow.
It was a big obsession for Joan. And Goldine is just sort of along for the ride. She's just sort of listening, right?
Right.
And they decided after, do we do poison? Do we do a knife? Do we do a gun? They decide that a gun would be the best weapon.
Okay. And
then they decided that Halloween would be the best time because they could wear a disguise and they'd just be thought of as a trick-or-treater.
Yeah.
Now, Goldine had never met Pete. She didn't even know what he looked like, but she found herself developing a deep hatred for him because of Joan. And Goldine had never even met Betty. She only spoke with her once on the phone where she told her she was looking forward to meeting her. On September 21st, 1957, Goldine buys a gun at the Pasadena gun shop. She takes a male friend with her to pick out the gun beforehand. She tells the salesman that she needed it for, quote, home protection, end quote. She picks out, or her male friend helps her pick out, a 38 Smith & Wesson. She got herself a 38 special.
Wow.
3 days later, Joan drives Goldine back to the gun shop, gives her the cash that she'll need to buy the gun, and 2 bullets. 2.
Okay. Wow. Was she on a budget or what?
I don't know, but she bought 2 bullets. I didn't even know you could buy like 1 bullet or 2 bullets. Maybe that was a thing in 1957. Don't know.
It was a Barney Fife moment.
It was exactly a Barney Fife moment.
She kept one in her pocket.
Yeah. Goldine would actually keep the gun until Halloween night. By the way, Goldine's about 5 feet tall. She's a short little thing. She's a tiny little thing.
Okay.
6 weeks later, Halloween night rolls around, and Joan shows up at Goldine's home with some clothes. Blue jeans, khaki jackets, hats, masks. I read in one source it was a mask like Robin of Batman and Robin, like an Incredibles mask.
Right.
And Joan brought makeup and red gloves. And Joan made up their faces, kind of like the Joker or something. They put on these masks, and they drove not in Joan's car, but in a car that Joan borrowed from her neighbor, Margaret Barrett.
Okay.
They arrived on Betty and Pete's Street, Community Street in Sun Valley, around 9 p.m. And they sat in the car in their costumes and masks and waited. Now, as for Pete and Betty, they spent the night handing out candy. Betty's son, Richard Solomon, who's 17 at the time, had left for a downtown bus depot because he needed to report back to his Navy station in San Diego. 17, does that mean that somebody had to sign for him to go into the military?
Yeah, I mean, you'd have to.
That's young.
Yeah, big time.
And then they also had Judy. She was a 15-year-old girl, and she was at a Halloween party that night at a valley playground. And Pete went and picked her up around 10:30 p.m. after the trick-or-treaters had come and gone. They stopped for some sandwiches, and they came home shortly before 11 p.m. Now, when they made it home, everybody goes to bed. Meanwhile, Goldine and Joan are still sitting in the car outside the Fabiano's house. They're just waiting and watching. And Pete and Betty climb into bed. They turn out the lights, and as soon as they did, the doorbell rings. They ignore it the first time, and then it rings again. And I think I read in one source that Judy called out to her parents, "Somebody's at the door." You know, I could hear our kids going, "Somebody get the door."
Is anybody going to answer the door?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Pete and Betty, they're lying in bed contemplating whether or not to go down and open the door to what they presume is going to be a late night trick-or-treater, right? It's Halloween after all. They'd spent much of the night just handing out candy to all these neighborhood kids. So Betty turns to Pete and said, "I don't think we have any candy left." But Pete was absolutely positive that they did because, quote, "Peter always insisted that we buy a lot of candy. He got a kick out of Halloween," end quote.
Okay.
So Betty's like, "I don't think we have any more candy." And Pete's like, "We got candy."
Yeah.
So Peter gets out of bed. He pulls on his robe and his slippers, which I think is so Leave It to Beaver. He's got slippers and a little robe, and he goes to the front door. He opens it. Betty's still in bed. She's upstairs in bed. And standing on the front porch, holding the 38 Special, inside a brown paper bag, is tiny little Goldine.
Wow.
Betty hears her husband laugh. She hears Pete laugh and say, quote, "Isn't it a little late for this?" End quote.
Yeah.
And then she heard somebody say, "No." Seconds later, gunfire rings out. Wow. You could hear the gunshot ring out through the entire house. Goldine turned on her heels. She runs right back to the car where Joan is waiting behind the wheel. And when Goldine gets back in the car, Joan's sitting there. Joan leans over, kisses her, and says, quote, "Thank you," end quote.
Jeez.
Then she peels out of the neighborhood. But nearby, there's a 15-year-old boy. He watches this car. He sees this car, and he watches it race out of the neighborhood. They like peel out, and they're wearing their Batman and Robin masks, right?
Right.
So Betty, after she hears this pop, she bolts down the stairs. She finds Peter lying on his back just inside the front door. There's blood seeping through his robe. He's clutching his chest. She hollers out for, you can tell I'm in Kentucky. She hollers out. She yells for her daughter, Judy. Yeah. She hollered out for her. And Judy comes running down. She sees what's going on. She leaves the house, goes 2 doors down where the Valley Division police officer lived. His name was Bud Alper. Okay. And he rushed over to the Fabiano's house. He called for backup, and he called for an ambulance. Now, Peter was immediately rushed to Sun Valley Receiving Hospital, where he was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. He was basically DOA.
Right.
He had been killed by this .38 caliber bullet. Goldine shot him just below the heart, but it penetrated his heart.
Gotcha.
As for Joan and Goldine, they returned the car, and before they walked their separate ways, Joan said, quote, "Forget you ever knew me," end quote.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Investigators show up at the house. They descend on the couple's home. They start asking questions. And immediately they speculated that the killer must have been dressed up in a Halloween outfit because of what Pete said. Isn't it a little bit late for this, right?
Right.
One of the first points of action for the investigators was to try and establish a motive. And they're really confused by this random act, this random act of violence.
Sure.
Because by all accounts, Pete was a really well-rounded, well-liked guy. And homicide detective Sergeant Charles Stewart commented in the media, quote, "We're doing a lot of legwork and checking into background principles," end quote. Checking into those principles.
Yep.
There was no weapon. There was no shell casing. So she must have picked it up when she left, but I never read that. And I don't think Goldine was smart enough to pick up the shell casing. Yeah. So maybe they just never found it.
Right.
But they never find a shell casing. It's just one shot. And Detective C.S. Stewart and Pat Keeley are assigned to the case.
Okay.
There was no attempt to steal anything in this beautifully furnished home. Police are baffled. And Detective Sergeant W.L. Wilkins said no one saw the killer arrive or leave. They don't know that yet.
Right.
The 15-year-old boy heard her peel out.
Sure.
But Pete didn't have any enemies, according to his wife, Betty, and she had no idea who killed him or would want him dead.
Right. Even though he was Italian, and especially in the late 50s, I mean, Mafia was huge at that time.
Yes.
And,
and he's a Fabiano.
Right?
Yeah.
So who knows?
The day after the murder, Goldine cut up the clothes she wore that night and she burned them. The case became known as the Trick-or-Treat Slayer in the newspapers, and it gripped not just California, but the nation. Because everybody's thinking, how many of us opened the door? Yeah. Just opened the door with, candy in our arms, thinking that someone innocent is standing on the front stoop.
Sure.
They took fingerprints from the doorbell. Somebody had to ring the doorbell.
Sure.
And there's actually a picture of them doing this. The next door neighbor is in this photograph. The next door neighbor is in his robe and slippers, but he's got a Marlboro hanging out of the corner of his mouth in this photo.
Yeah.
And all I could think of was, it's 1957.
Yeah, exactly.
1957.
I was about ready to say the same thing.
But police think that because of how Pete reacted after answering the door, that there may have been 2 people there and that they were in costume. Mm-hmm. And police think that maybe, just maybe, what Rob is thinking, that it was a mob hit because it looked like one.
Right.
Ring the doorbell, shoot him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Take the cannoli. Leave the gun, take the cannoli.
It's like when Michael in The Godfather, when they're at the Italian restaurant.
Yeah.
He goes to the bathroom and he gets the gun, comes out, boom, shows them both. Walks away, throws the gun down, walks away.
He lets the gun fall from his hand.
Yeah.
Yeah. But Pete didn't have any associations with the mob. I mean, he had that bookmaking charge in New York from years before.
Sure.
But nothing else. 2 weeks pass, and Goldine still has this gun she murdered Pete with. So she takes it to a What's the worst thing you think somebody could do with a murder weapon?
Take it to a pawn shop.
She doesn't do that.
Okay.
She takes it to a downtown LA mall, and she puts it in a locker. There used to be lockers at malls.
Mm-hmm.
She puts it in a locker and walks away.
Okay.
When Betty calms down and the police have a chance to speak with her, I actually read in the newspaper that Betty and Judy both had been sedated because they couldn't deal with anything. And I was like, oh my gosh, they're just shoving the narcotics at people.
Yeah.
While the police chief is smoking in his pajamas on the front step. Yeah.
With a bourbon. I'm just kidding.
Yeah. But when Betty calms down and the police have a chance to talk to her, they ask her, who would want to do this to Pete? Betty, we really want you to think hard.
Right.
Who would want to do this?
Yeah.
And Betty says, well, there is someone who wanted him gone. Her name was Joan Robble.
Whoa.
So police go and they pick up Joan. They actually pick her up. They arrest her at a friend's house in Pomona, and they ask her some questions. Where were you the night of the murder?
Mm-hmm,
Where were you?
Right.
On October 31st at 11 p.m. Why would Betty think that you might want to hurt Pete? And Joan described the Fabianos as, quote, two of my close friends, end quote. She tells the police, I was home the night of the murder.
Okay.
She tells them, I used to work part-time for Pete and for Betty at the Sun Valley Beauty Shop, and I was a frequent visitor to the Fabiano home. But Joan actually has a record. 3 priors for burglary and violation of the Alcohol Beverage Control Act.
Really? Wow. Go Joan.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But Joan is soon released because they didn't have enough evidence to hold her.
Mm-hmm.
2 weeks after the murder, the gun is found in a rental locker in the downtown department store. Why might they look there? Well, they got an anonymous tip.
Oh.
They take the gun out. It's still got 1 bullet in the chamber. They bought 2. And according to Sergeant Stewart, a ballistics check showed that the gun in the locker was the murder weapon and matched the bullet retrieved from Pete's heart. And they run the registration on the gun, and it comes back to Goldine Pizer, a med tech at the Children's Hospital.
I wonder where that anonymous call came from.
Yeah.
Wow.
Goldine is arrested at her home in Hollywood. And as soon as they get her into an interrogation room, she says, quote, it's a relief to get it off my mind, end quote.
Really?
She tells Detective Charles S. Stewart and Detective Sergeant Pat Keeley of the Valley Division, I did it. Goldine tells police that she was talked into killing Pete by Joan.
Wow.
Quote, I wish I'd called the police. So many times I tried to get her to go to the police and tell them about Fabiano. I didn't know what kind of woman she really is. I didn't know how cold she was until today. I never wanted to hurt anyone. I quit my job as a lab technician because I couldn't prick people's fingers. I've always led a quiet, decent life. What will my friends think? I just wanted to help. End quote.
You know, if one of my friends came to me and said, hey, listen, I need your help and I need you to shoot somebody.
Yeah.
I'm thinking I would probably go, you're not my friend anymore.
Yeah. Who is that gullible? Who, is that even the word for it? Yeah. I mean, to be that gullible, she believes her that Fabiano, why just jump on this train for no reason?
Yeah. Stupid.
Well, because she loves Joan.
Yeah.
She loves her.
Yep.
Goldine tells the police that when the lights went out at the Fabiano house on Halloween night, Joan waited in the car while she went to the door.
Okay.
Quote, I got out with a paper bag on my hand and walked to the door. I rang it once, and when nothing happened, rang again. When Pete Fabiano answered the door, he said, don't you think it's a little late for this? I fired, using both hands on the gun. I ran to the car and Joan drove to Margaret Barrett's home, the owner of the car. Wow. We left the car on the street, separated, and walked to our homes. All we talked about was Peter Fabiano. Joan said he was a vile, evil man, one who destroyed all of the people about him. I developed a deep hatred for him. End quote.
Wow.
And Goldine, she's singing like a canary.
Yeah, big time.
And the police are like, whoa, 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 whoa. Back up, back up, back up. Mm-hmm. Joan borrowed a car? So now police go after Joan one more time, and they find her at her attorney's office, of all places. But they don't tell her that Goldine has spilled her guts.
Right.
It's November 12th, and Joan was ordered rearrested on a bench warrant issued by Superior Judge Drucker, and Detective Lieutenant Ernest Johnson, commander of the Valley Division Detective Bureau, tells Joan once they get her into an interrogation room that Goldine had admitted that she and Joan planned the murder for months.
Wow.
They tell her, Joan, your alibi is crap. We know you borrowed a car from your neighbor, Margaret Barrett.
Right.
And we actually called her, and she said, yes, Joan, a dear friend of mine, had borrowed my car on Halloween night. A car that matched the description that the 15-year-old boy told the police had peeled out of the neighborhood.
Yeah.
And now police have a full picture of what transpired. Peter fired the receptionist, and she began plotting her revenge. Joan turned to her friend Goldine Pizer, whom she groomed and seduced to kill Peter.
Right.
Their plan was to use the holiday of Halloween to knock on the door, and Goldine would just shoot him dead. And once the plot was finished, Joan told her girlfriend it was best if they never saw each other again, leaving little Goldine alone and scared. So after she did everything for her,
right,
on the street that night, she says, you never knew me.
Yep.
And once police traced the gun to her, she confessed everything immediately. Quote, Joan looked at Goldine, who had just murdered her enemy for her, and said, quote, forget you ever knew me, end quote, and walked away.
Man.
I mean, the police are telling the press this.
Yeah.
Goldine testifies before the grand jury and says that Joan got her to commit the murder by portraying Peter as a symbol of evil. Quote, she painted him as a vile, evil man who wanted to destroy all the people around him, and although I've never seen him, I built up an intense hatred for him, end quote.
Man.
Goldine didn't even know Peter.
Yeah.
She'd never met him. She claims that the only reason she killed Pete was to please Joan, saying that Joan had a, quote, spell over her, end quote. And she realized that Joan had been feeding her lies about Peter. There was no evidence that Peter was abusive. It was just simply a ruse to get Goldine to carry out the murder.
Right.
And after Goldine made a full and detailed confession, she said, quote, I wish I'd called the police so many times, end quote.
I bet she does.
Initially, both women pled innocent to first-degree murder. Joan pled not guilty to the killing, while Goldine pled not guilty by reason of insanity.
Wow.
Goldine was examined by psychiatrists who said, no, Goldine's completely sane.
She's fine.
She's obsessed with Joan, but that's about it.
Yeah.
They would both later change their pleas to guilty of second-degree murder, and on April 18th, 1958, they were sentenced to imprisonment for 5 years to life.
5 years?
Mm-hmm. We're going to talk about that in a sec.
Okay.
When they're sentenced, Goldine is crying. She's breaking down while she's hearing her sentence. And Joan is smiling ear to ear as they hear Judge Albert Wheatcroft hand it down.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
They're both sent to Corona Women's Prison. Now, when all the fireworks were over, Betty wasn't all that surprised at what had happened. Quote, Pete was the only one who had Joan figured out for what she is. We separated because of my friendship with her. Finally, we reconciled when I realized that my husband was right. Joan is cold, cruel, and inhumane, and no heart. Even now, I'm sure she has no feeling of regret. She's a real Lucretia Borgia. At first, I thought no torture would be good enough. Now, so what? Nothing will bring him back, no matter what they do to her." End quote.
Wow.
As for Goldine, she just kept saying the same thing over and over again. "Joan told me to do it. Joan told me to do it."
Wow.
Quote, "I've always been the kind of person who's faithful to my friends. Joan was my friend. I've known her for 4 years. I was worried about her. She kept telling me about Peter Fabiano, how much he hated her. I couldn't think anymore. She almost had me under a hypnotic spell. I've never hurt anyone, but I'd do anything for a friend." End quote. And she did.
Yeah, big time.
Betty sold the beauty salon after Peter's death, both of them. She remarried in 1966 and passed away in 1999. Goldine Pizer died in 1998. As for Joan, after her life of infamous trick-or-treat murdering, when she's set free from prison, no one ever hears from her again.
Really?
The rest of her life is a mystery.
Wow.
Much like her life before.
Yeah.
There was some public outcry after 2 women who plotted for 3 months to kill a man in his own home only got 5 to life.
Yeah.
They were like, is that the going rate for murder now? Because if it was a man, he would have been put away forever.
Yep.
But they took into consideration that Goldine was simply Joan's stooge. She'd manipulated her into doing her dirty work. And Joan didn't do anything but drive the car. She didn't pull the trigger.
Right.
So, were they right just to give them 5 to life? I mean, they both got out and lived lives. We don't know what happened to Joan.
Yeah.
We know that Goldine lived her life, and she stayed in California until she died. I think she was 81 when she passed away.
Okay.
And poor Peter Fabiano.
Yeah.
All he did was love his wife, try to keep her away from Joan, and he lost his life for it.
Yeah.
But that is the story of the trick-or-treat murder of 1957, and that's all I have to say about that. For nearly 7 years, Jane Doe has lived in the shadows, her past buried deep beneath layers of secrecy and silence. After completing more than was asked of her in her last assignment for the enigmatic Kaiwolf project, Jane Doe vanished without a trace, leaving behind a trail of dead bodies and unanswered questions. But now, as the specter of her past returns with a vengeance, Jane finds herself thrust back into a world she thought she'd left behind forever. When her former sins come knocking on her door, Jane is faced with an impossible choice: continue to hide in the shadows, or once again take up arms against the forces that threaten to tear apart the fabric of society. With enemies lurking around every corner and allies who may not be what they seem, Jane must rely on her wits, training, and her unyielding determination to survive. And while trust is a luxury she cannot afford, Jane must confront the truth about herself and her past. As the clock ticks, she realizes that the line between family, friend, and foe are razor thin, and in the end, the only person she can rely on is herself. Jane Doe 4 Charlotte is available September 24th, 2024. No name, no regrets, no mercy.
Wow, what a really scary case that turned out to be. In fact, it's so scary that anytime Ariel walks up on our sidewalk for candy and Halloween, I'm going to be extremely suspicious.
Listen, we sit out on the front stoop because it is a constant stream of Ariels and Minecraft and
Ninja Turtles,
Spider-Man. Yeah.
All right. Well, let's try to relax and do a little bless your heart.
Well, bless your heart.
All right. This first one I'm calling I didn't think anyone would notice. And also, I'm going to preface this by saying this is the shortest one I've ever done, but it's so good and stupid.
Kind of like my case today.
Yeah. A man parked a car in a parking spot reserved for law enforcement at a Walmart in Tulsa, Oklahoma.
Ooh, that's a big mistake.
Yeah. The police looked up the plates, found the car was stolen, went into the Walmart, and took the driver into custody. I know it's short, but I love that one.
Oh, my gosh. Why would you park a stolen car in that spot?
That one even made me laugh.
Maybe in the mall cop spot. You know how the cop from the mall always has his own little spot? Yeah.
Oh, my God.
Maybe that spot, but not smart.
All right, number 2. Where's the North Star when you need it?
Okay, somebody's lost.
Yeah, Michigan State Police responded to a call about a man that broke into a home while the homeowners were present. The homeowner at first thought the man was her husband and screamed once she realized that it wasn't. Her husband came down from upstairs and told the intruder to leave. I'm sure he said it nicely.
Yeah.
The intruder left and fled into the northern Michigan woods to get away from the cops.
Oops.
Canine police were unable to find the man until the intruder realized that he was lost and had to call 911 to come rescue him.
Yeah.
He's facing charges for breaking and entering and resisting arrest.
You know what? Sometimes it's amazing to me that our ancestors were able to navigate by sea and on land by looking at the heavens.
Oh, I know. It's
And now we can't get anywhere without GPS.
Exactly. If I don't have my iPhone, I can't get to Kroger.
It's crazy. I always thought because I had to use a card catalog to do research and actually go to the library that the kids had it so much better because they had Google. But now they have artificial intelligence.
ChatGPT.
Yeah.
Good Lord.
I mean, there's no reason to even do any work. It's crazy.
Love to have had that in college. All right.
No, you wouldn't have.
All right. Number 3. I want to go fast.
Ricky Bobby.
You got it. According to reports, Alexis Ibarra Gomez, that's the suspect, is accused of shooting at a motorist who was trying to get his license plate number to report him to police for driving erratically.
Okay.
Police eventually saw the man driving the wrong way down a street in the vehicle that was reported by the previous motorist, a stolen black truck.
Okay.
He refused to pull over and led cops on a high-speed chase. Gomez eventually crashed the truck and broke into a home. There he stole, and here we go, this is the best. There he stole and put on a Ricky Bobby costume from Talladega Nights and attempted to flee on a bike with 2 flat tires.
No way. That's not true.
It is true. Gomez was arrested and charged with attempted first-degree assault, attempting to elude police, first-degree burglary, and more. I want to go fast.
That was the only thing he could find was a Ricky Bobby costume?
I'm sure it wasn't, but if you saw Ricky Bobby's costume there, what are you going to do?
That's not inconspicuous at all.
Well, I'm sure he knew he was going to get caught, so why not go out with a little bit of flair?
It's too good. That is too good. Oh, Lord. Maybe he had a bobcat with him in the car. That's why he crashed in the first place.
Yeah.
Got to know the movie. Well, if you have a bless your heart or you know somebody's heart who needs blessing, all you got to do is go to hitchedtohomicide.com. When you get there, you'll find a pull-down menu. Yep. While you're there, you can also suggest a case or tell us about your brush with true crime.
Please do.
That's my amazing husband out there who's getting ready for Halloween next week.
Yep, and my beautiful bride in the booth.
Join us next time on Hitched to Homicide.
Bye, y'all.